Hello folks, and welcome back to part 2 of our interview here on Irish Whip Wrestling History with John Noble, Northern Ireland promoter. He was the first modern day wrestling promoter in Ireland, Northern Ireland, from 1995 till 2010. And John, we first met each other in 2002. Technically I had sold on 2 shows to you through Scott Conway for a commission. And some of the wrestlers I had been using on the show that day or that weekend then went up to work for you up in Northern Ireland. They included Michael Kovac, a wrestler from Hungary. He wrestled in ECW for a little bit. Chris the Bambi Killer. I think he had a little stint in Florida for the WWE. He's from Austria. Robbie Brookside. He's probably the most recognisable name on that tour. We had Flatliner, and you had 2 Americans on that, Lex Lovett and Eric Priest.
That's right, yes. I had been doing sort of like a little bit of sort of work locally in terms of promoting drugs awareness around schools for school kids. And I'd done, used a few sports people, so I was obviously working up to doing another tour. So I was able to bring over 2 Americans, and we helped promote drugs awareness around schools, but also then do the shows for me.
As time went on, you went from running all across Northern Ireland to mainly around the Down Antrim area, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was around. I started restricting it. Instead of doing like a week-long tour, like for maybe 7 or 8 nights, I was down to doing just 2 or 3 nights. Just simply because at that time numbers were sort of starting to decline a little bit in terms of, and some of the venues and some of the areas I would have probably normally went to, I didn't think it was financially viable to run shows, so I sort of restricted down to the 2 or 3 shows at the time.
What I thought was interesting, so some of the guys that came up from the Irish Whip show, like I said, some of the Europeans, it made sense because they were actually in Dublin already.
Yeah.
But Lex Lovett and Eric Priest were 2 regional wrestlers in Florida at the time. That was a very unique pairing to bring in.
Yeah, it probably was like, I had obviously got, by that stage, developed a lot of different links and various different promoters, not just in the UK and Ireland, but also in a few in America, because I brought some people over before. And sometimes I think then people got in contact with you and said, look, I believe you took some Americans over for shows. Would you be interested? And just I think one of them had made contact with me at the time, and eventually I sort of agreed then, come on over. With Lex, it was quite interesting because he had experience of doing drugs awareness in schools and stuff like that, so that was really the bit of the draw I wanted to get out. So as well as having the shows, I was doing my other piece of work, which sort of fell under my public relations work that I used to do quite a bit. So it probably, on reflection, you think, okay, it worked really well, but I was taking a gamble with 2 possibly unknown people. But there was that added attraction with the drugs awareness side of things.
I think was Eric Priest calls himself the underwear model.
He did, yes, yeah. He had that was his sort of wrestling name. And I've noticed recently I still would be friends on Facebook with him, but I noticed he had dropped out of wrestling for a while, but I've noticed that he's back in again, but I don't think he's using the term that term anymore. I think he's moved on.
Lex Lovett was the same. He dropped out of wrestling for a few years, and he's back, I think, around the Florida scene again.
Yeah, I think, yes, just recently.
What I thought was interesting on that show, obviously one of the sources of income is pictures in the ring with wrestlers, and it might be Eric Priest, but one of those Americans had a UWF championship belt, and it was the UWF belt from Herb Abrams' promotion. Right. And I always wondered, was that because back then there wasn't such thing as replica belts really of independent groups. So you wouldn't know, was that the actual?
If I can remember, that was Lex Lovett actually brought the belt, and my understanding was the original one, because you're quite right, there isn't. There is obviously replicas, but they're normally plastic. But that was actually one of the original ones, and I think it was one that he brought. And as I said, like anything, it went down a storm with the people looking to get the photographs.
But I think for a lot of people there, to them it was a belt. Some of the fans just a belt, instead of knowing the history of what was behind
it's probably like anything. I always used to find when you were doing shows and the audience were getting their photographs taken afterwards, they were just so taken by the photograph that they didn't
Yeah.
realise what if there was a piece of history or something sitting in front of them.
So,
and it could have hit them up the face, and they still, well, I got a picture.
So I always remember, because I was only starting out. Obviously, it was green, and I had a lot to learn still around 2002. But I actually enjoyed those few shows up here in Downpatrick. It was a lot of fun. Robbie Brookside and the Flatliner, Chris Mans. Great characters, lots of fun. That's what I remember most about that. And there was some fans, lady fans, hung around that after the shows, and there's lots of drinks had and lots of fun.
Well, it's probably like anything that we, you know, I'm sort of a great believer in. Like, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that, you know, if you're doing shows, it has, you know, you have to enjoy it. You have to be, and you know, not having stress and strain of organising them all the time. So sometimes the after part of shows is actually is quite good and quite enjoyable, and makes them take away from all the stress and strain. So yeah, we had some very, very good party nights, so to speak, afterwards.
And then I was introduced, well, we were introduced to a Chinese, I don't know what your local Chinese restaurant.
Yes, it was, if I can remember, it was the Emperor Chinese restaurant, because I think if I can remember, it was just recently opened, so it was one of the main, you know, Chinese restaurants to go to.
Ones.
Yeah, one of the fancy ones, yeah. So yes, because I remember then we went there one night for a meal after the show. And, you know, that's where you sort of bond and make friendships with people, and like, you know, obviously we've been still in contact all these years. There's other people you don't see, you haven't heard from, you know, so that's all part and parcel of it.
It was great, because every time I think of Downpatrick, for some reason I think of that Chinese, because every time we did shows with Downpatrick, it was always back to that Chinese restaurant.
It's because probably at that point in time we didn't really have a lot of good restaurants in Downpatrick. We've come on a little bit better than that, but you know, you would have had that, and then obviously Denver's, which would have probably been, you know, I would have been getting some of the wrestlers to stay in Denver, so sometimes I might have had a meal there. But Chinese food tends to always goes down very well, especially a good one, you know.
So in part one of this interview, John went into depth of his history of his shows basically in Northern Ireland from 1995 to 2002. What I think is great, so when me and you met, we got rid of, well, we didn't get rid of, but we didn't have to use the English promoters anymore.
Yeah.
We could do it between ourselves, so there was just Irish promoters putting shows on and helping each other out, which had never been done in that time frame. I think maybe the last time that would have happened was maybe in the 80s to 70s.
Yeah, you probably would have been, probably that period was been the last time there would have been some sort of cross-working. And yeah, it was actually good, you know, to start that, because I'm, you know, probably, and if I look back on a lot of the shows that I did promote, I always had established stars, but I also like to give up and coming or new people an opportunity, because we all have to start somewhere, you know, and I always liked that idea, you know. So certainly, you know, getting to work with yourself was good, because you had some really good up and coming young talent, and it was good to be able to actually showcase them and help them on their journey.
One of the misconceptions about Northern Ireland from people in Europe or anywhere else in the world, they think it's a danger zone.
Yeah.
They come to Northern Ireland, they're going to get shot or blown up. I can remember being in the ring van with Frank Casey, the Midge. Little Frankie, people probably recognise him from refereeing days in the World of Sport and so forth. When he'd come to Northern Ireland, he was terrified. And he was, oh my, what's going to happen here? And then you drive into an area, say that the president has the Union Jack up. Oh, it's great, I'm safe here. And then you come to the next town that'll have a tricolour, and then you'd be afraid. The misconceptions around Northern Ireland.
Yeah, you know, I was born in Northern Ireland, grew up in Northern Ireland, always lived in Northern Ireland throughout all my life, and it's unbelievable when I go not just around Ireland and the UK but across the world, where you find people just think we are like a war zone and we were killing each other every morning, every noon, every afternoon, and you had to try and dispel that. And it's the same when I was trying to, you know, sometimes book people who would say, oh, I'm not coming over there, I'm not, you know, it's too dangerous. And you know, I've one story actually, not from my wrestling sort of side of business, but from my other PR stuff, where I had you know, a young pop star was coming over from England to do a couple of TV shows over here and perform over here. And when I picked him and his manager up at the airport, the next thing he disappeared from my eye line. And I thought, where is he? Where is he gone? I thought he had got into the wrong car or something. And the next thing I found him, he was looking under the car to see if there was any bombs. And I'm going, do you think I was going to actually blow you up when I've got you here? And then it just gelled on me that I thought, he's actually wearing combat gear, because combat gear was the in thing at that time, and I said, that's not the right dress code to come to Northern Ireland. I think when you get to the hotel, you'll change.
My own story, I remember at one stage I used to sell shows to the Shankill Leisure Centre. So the Shankill region of Belfast is predominantly the English British area. So I'd have a lot of Union Jacks and flags. And again, people being afraid coming into Northern Ireland. I can remember on that particular, I think it was the first show we did up there, and it was Drew McIntyre, Sheamus, and Pac. Pac is an English wrestler. Neville in the WWE, and he's in AEW now. But he was the last guy to pick up. We're in a little minibus. We go to the airport, and he's wearing a bright emerald green, the colour of shamrock hoodie. And I just said, look, where we're going, you might want to just change the colour of your top. And the whole way up, he was afraid. Really nice guy, and he was all like, until we got there. And then there's two leisure centres on Shankill Road, an old one and a new one. Of course, we didn't know which one it was. And we went to the old leisure centre, and everybody got off the minibus as we're going in. We're all being looked at because of the plates, Irish licence plates and whatnot. A very staunch president area. And as we're going in, your man said, you have the wrong leisure centres up the road. And I just remember everybody running back to the bus
as fast as they could,
thinking someone's going to shoot them with a sniper or something like.
Yeah, no, we had loads of loads of stories of various things that happened over the years. I was always fortunate. Maybe I don't know whether it was because I live here and sort of know, but street cred, so to speak. But never really had any issues, and I always found no matter what area you went into, once you were doing the show, you had no problems because people were there to enjoy the wrestling. Yeah. That's really what it is. And sometimes people always say, sport can transcend all the barriers that we have for getting together. And it is true sometimes, sport can bring people together. You're there to enjoy the show. You don't really care what religion you are. You're just there to enjoy the wrestling. And everybody wants to boo at the baddie and everybody wants to cheer at the good guy, So that's the main thing, just enjoy it.
I do know, obviously back in the day we spoke about in part one how it was different, and basically the promoters and the majority of the wrestlers were presidents, and this day and age it means nothing, but back then, because everything was so segregated, it meant something. So I always found it interesting that you'd only go to certain areas, but while people in these communities might have had a problem, the guys on the show wrestled each other and you were friends, and so it really did bring people together, and it still does. I know this day it means absolutely nothing to somebody's religious status and so forth, but back then it was completely a different kettle of fish. And when things got bad in whatever you want to call it, the troubles or the problems in Northern Ireland, the wrestling stopped. It actually stopped running, just in case somebody would get hurt from the wrestling side of it. So that's a part of history beyond wrestling that wrestling's a part of that nobody talks about. So
it's also in the same context you find, like I was obviously running, started doing shows, and we still had the troubles, as we define it in terms. So we still had the troubles, and obviously there was huge risks in bringing a group of predominantly English-speaking, wrestlers over to here to do shows. But as I said, I never really found any bother or any issues, no matter where I went in Northern Ireland. People came to see the wrestling, and it didn't matter, what language they were speaking or whatever, where they were from, because in the height of the troubles you would have had issues, if people over here with English speaking accents, sometimes it didn't go down very well in certain areas. But my own personal view of the troubles is, it happened, it was real, we can't take it away from it, but it was probably a small minority of people involved in that type of activity. The majority of people just wanted to get on with their lives, like go to wrestling shows, go to any sporting event. They weren't really interested in, where the people were from. They were saying, well, I'm here to watch wrestling, So that's it.
And it's quite interesting because I know myself over the years, I sold, I'd say of all the shows I've ever done up in Northern Ireland, I would say half of them, if not more, were actually sold shows. And a lot of them were in Protestant communities, and no one cared, like you said, when you're going up. I used to remember sometimes in the license plate, and you stop people for directions in the street and they'd ignore you.
Yeah.
They would dodge you in the street. But an hour later, you're doing a show, and I remember recognising one woman in the audience with her son just clapping. And one of the same ones ignored us on the street, like, so it's quite interesting.
It's nearly like I remember talking to somebody years and years ago, and they were saying, like, when they went to watch a wrestling show, life switched off. They just switched off from life, which is, I think, is brilliant, because they're there to enjoy themselves, to really have a good time. Watch the matches, boo and cheer whenever they need to, and just enjoy it. And I always thought that's a nice way of actually thinking about it, because we were providing that entertainment that basically allowed people to switch off from what was going on. They could go back to their life afterwards. But when that show was on, they were just focused on the wrestling. And I also remember reading an article years and years ago too, where the Queen Mother, before she passed away, when wrestling was on ITV at 4:00 on a Saturday afternoon, apparently she was glued to it. And basically, in her world, based on the story, I assume there's some accuracy to it, but from 4:00 to whenever the wrestling finished, she was into the wrestling, and that was it. Nothing else was worried. She wasn't worried about anything else in her life.
I saw an interesting picture there recently of Paul McCartney back in Liverpool in the 70s or maybe the late 60s, and he's there with two wrestling posters in Liverpool, as in he was going to the shows.
Yeah,
I found that quite interesting.
It's the same. I think sometimes wrestling can get a reputation that it's not as popular as what it is. But when you actually drill down into talking to people, you find there's actually more wrestling fans than probably you know about, and they're from all walks of life. I remember being in America, and I went to a show that I was doing some work with the wrestler I mentioned earlier, Jake the Ripper, Damien, and I'd gone to see one of his shows when I was over in America, and I remember sitting talking to one of the guys afterwards, and he was talking about the same thing. It covers all class and creative people and stuff like that. And he says, and I'm a stockbroker by trade, and I sort of looked at him and thought, I would never have guessed you'd been a stockbroker.
I remember one time I had a talent trade agreement going with a promoter in North New Jersey in America, and we were there, and he had a festival run in Middlesex, I think it was, for a week, and there was one guy booked on the show, and he was smoking a joint, and he looked like a real rough character, and and his opponent in the match was a policeman. Right. I just thought that was amazing. There's something together.
There's the balance, a complete different balance of person.
On a little sidebar, Whiplash TV, on the first series of Whiplash I did back in 2005 on the Wrestling Channel. So obviously it was broadcast on Sky Digital, and you had people from all over Ireland, UK, parts of Europe. But in series 1, what I used to do to give lads some experience and let them work twice, I let them do a gimmick called the Blagger Boys. Now, a Blagger Boy in Dublin slang is an armed robber, a gangster. So they would put balaclava on, and they would put overalls on. You cut the sleeves out. So basically, it's an armed robber, it's a blagger, and the joke is they're heels, and you might try and rob somebody's stuff at ringside. But people in England thought it was an IRA gimmick.
Yes.
And I never twigged it at the time. And they were getting complaints about the Blagger Boys, so we had to actually stop that gimmick completely.
It's that is probably typical of lots of things that happen across the world, where you do something, you think, well, that's a great thing to do, but then it has a different meaning somewhere else. And it's the same. I've been in obviously in London loads of times, but I remember years and years ago being in London, and there was a discussion started about what political persuasion are you, what religion, and all this here, and I was like, getting into that. That's just not me. I don't go along and ask people, what religion you are. But this conversation went on anyhow, and one of the people I was speaking to turned around and said, well, because there was another guy from Northern Ireland there as well, and he turned around and he said, but your accent's completely different to his. And I said, yeah, yours is completely different from somebody from Liverpool. That doesn't mean we're alien. It's just, you get to the stage where you think sometimes, people are trying to find more out of it, and people are very easily offended. And I think probably it's more so today.
People are very offended.
And I have a brilliant saying that a friend of mine once told me and said, people go out of their way to be offended, and I think it is true, so that there, nobody has actually thought of that in the context of the wrestling. They've just thought of it as terrorism.
What I thought was interesting, obviously on shows down in the Republic, Dublin, Cork, wherever you are, I would use the English wrestler, and you play Rule Britannia, you come out in a Union Jack, and he's the bad guy automatically, everybody's booing him and whatnot. Now you can't really do that because you're seeing as forcing hate onto people.
Yeah, yes.
And I remember on a Brian Dixon show in England, I'm going back years ago, obviously he had flags for the good guy, the bad guy. And I think it was a Middle Eastern wrestler he used. I'm not sure of the nationality's flag, but it was a Middle Eastern flag. And of course, he's not British, he gets booed. And there was a big write-up in the paper and on the local BBC radio station. And that stopped after that. So it's completely changed now.
It's a similar, when I was doing some work with the American the wrestler Jake the Ripper Damien, he went over to work in England for a couple of weeks after he'd done shows with me, and he was going over to work with one of the English promoters, and they said, oh, you're going to have to drop the Ripper because we had Jack the Ripper and everybody associated with murder and death, and we're going, why? But they ran with it the first night, the first show. It went down an absolute storm. The guy was hugely popular after the first night. Yeah, you have to keep the Ripper. We'll keep the Ripper, But again, it's back to this, you have to get rid of it because it had, bad connotations, and stuff like that there. But yeah, it's hard to know. You do see sometimes things in that, and you do try to be sensitive towards things. So when I was doing shows, I would have never have done anything in terms of the whole religious thing here in Northern Ireland. It was straight wrestling shows, and if there was gimmicks, it wasn't in any way linked to religion because you just avoided it because it was easier. But yeah, you'd have got the media on you if you had done something. If I had probably tried to do something like, had a Protestant fight a Catholic or something like that, the media just would have been all over it. So you just avoided it. But it's hard if you're doing something that you're doing locally, but it is going to go across and be shown in the UK. It's going to happen.
And what else I think is from an Irish history point of view. Well, so when you were running your shows, it was always predominantly English wrestlers, English wrestlers or Americans. And the same, so in 2002, when I used to solo shows, same thing, European wrestlers and Americans. But then in 2004, when I opened up the school, I started in 2002, started training lads in 2000, not me personally, but training lads 2004. So in those shows in 2004 that we were doing, it was the first time you actually had Irish wrestlers.
That's right, yeah.
9 years later.
Yeah,
on the show.
It was. It's like anything, if you're running a business, you work with what you have. At that point, there wasn't really a plentiful supply of local talent in terms of wrestlers.
Actually, really.
And it's only when yourself came along that started to change. So it then meant that obviously I could change because then I had a supply where I don't really need to rely on other people. And one of the things when that sort of started to happen, I was very keen, as well as having some established wrestlers on my shows, I also wanted to, bring in some people who were up and coming, new talent so that they had a chance to shine, in a ring.
What I thought was quite interesting, so I would basically sell you the core of a show. I'd turn up with equipment, I'd turn up the basic crew, your refs, your ring announcer, and then you would bring in American talent as well on top of that. We might share American talent, but sometimes you would bring in your own talent, and then if I was running afterwards down south, I would use them. And one particular tour, the first one you used that had Irish talent, it was actually loaded. You had Fast Eddie, he was a name at the time, he's since gone out of business. Mikey Batts, people remember
That's
him,
right,
TNA.
from Florida, yeah.
You had Matt Striker from WWE, and you had Xavier. There's a name.
That's right. Yes.
Who actually Ring of Honor champion.
Who just sadly, was it last year? I saw passed away last year.
Yeah.
Quite suddenly and sadly. Yeah. You know, it was again getting the balance, given that American appeal to the show, but also again being able to incorporate Irish and local talent onto it. So it gave that wider sort of like you know, you're not just going to see a company or a show that is all really local people. It has a wider, a more wider appeal for the audience, and that's what they.
And I thought it was quite interesting on that particular tour. The Irish talent I brought up, you were only starting out where, Madman Manson, he didn't quite become the character yet. He was MC and he was doing ring crew. There was Joe Cabaret. He went on to establish OTT. And then there was Goldove. Do you remember Goldove?
Yes.
Goldove was Sheamus. And Sheamus had this, well, at the time as Goldove, to be an MMA fighter like Goldberg.
That's right, yes.
Which I was absolutely ridiculous gimmick. But he had the MMA gloves and the shorts. And I can remember the Americans. I think Xavier had a background in some kind of martial arts.
That's right. He came from a martial arts background. So, and then obviously moved across into wrestling and was Ring of Honor, if I can remember at the time. He was with Ring of Honor. So yeah, there was a really diverse
but with those
roster.
two guys, it was quite interesting because they thought he actually trained in MMA, which he didn't.
Yes.
And I remember Xavier saying, "Hey, what's that guy's story? Is he going to shoot me?" And they were getting ready. Well, he was anyway. I remember Xavier saying, "If he does that on me in that ring, I'm going to hurt him." And Sheamus hadn't a clue. He was just a gimmick he wanted.
Yeah, it was just they wanted to try it out, you know.
Like, huh?
And again, it was, you know, it's good that you have, you know, you can at times put on a roster like that because you've just got a complete different background of wrestlers who will all bring something different to the shows, and all characters in their own name, whether it's a character that we don't want them to do.
And it was quite interesting. Because obviously up until 2004 I'd used exclusively, like yourself, American and English talent because there was no Irish talent. So for them to be around those Americans, it was interesting because wrestlers in general, regardless of what nationality they are, can be very what way would I describe it without being rude? They go on like children sometimes.
Yeah,
divas,
yes.
and, you know.
Yeah. You've got lots of drama sometimes when you're trying to obviously work with them.
So the Irish guys got to see all the drama with the Americans. Irish guys were doing their own drama in their own way, and I remember it was not the shows, but just the conflict that was going on. The
and the dynamics, the dynamics behind the scenes, you know. And it is, you know, because probably in my early days, I was sort of using, you know, obviously partnership with the English promoters. You were using mostly all English-based wrestlers, so it was very much like your World of Sport type of technical wrestling and stuff like that. There, I think I remember even a couple of times they did the, you know, 6 rounds type of thing, you know, and stuff like that. But when I sort of started bringing the Americans in, it was a completely different concept because out went the rounds and it was just potentially up to 20 minutes of wrestling. And, you know, different styles of wrestling, you know, and so, some Americans will tell you that they love coming to the UK because it gives them an opportunity to see a different style of wrestling. And the same with the people in the UK and Ireland, they say, oh, you know, we learn a lot from the Americans. So it's good to bring that, but it also is good because I always think of, you know, your customer, you know, people coming to see your shows. Are they going to enjoy the show? Are they going to like what they're seeing? Are they going to, you know, really take a dislike to one of the heels or whatever? You know, that is what your focus is, to put on a good show, which again brings people back the next time, you know. So if you book guys and they don't put on a good show, then it's something you then reflect on and say, well, okay, I'm not going to do that next time round.
And speaking of such, merchandise in the early days wasn't really sold.
No, I again, it's probably back to, I was fresh into the business, a bit green, and merchandise wasn't a big thing that I could see. It's only when I started going to other promotions and I could see that, actually merchandising is quite a big thing. And gradually I started getting into that part of it as well, and obviously making some money from that. And one of the things I remember doing, which was a huge money generator, but didn't seem like something you would want to do, is that you always at the end of the show, the last man standing in the ring, the winner, who's normally the good guy of the night, it was getting your photograph taken with him with a belt and in the ring and stuff like that there. And I remember it used to hold us back for an hour and a half at the end of the show. They were trying to strip the ring down and everybody wanted to go home or go to the Chinese for dinner. But here we were still doing Polaroids, and back then, if I can remember, when we started doing them, they were like £5 for a Polaroid, and like £5 back then was quite a lot of money, particularly if it was a family. But they were rushing in their droves to get it, and it probably was not just the star of the show they were getting the photograph, but if they had a belt, that was a big thing. But quite a lot of the times when you were thinking, well, kid will really be impressed by the belt. Wasn't the belt, it was the wrestler. They were so keen to be able to,
in the ring as well.
They're standing in the ring. And I say on many's a show we spent maybe an hour and a half taking Polaroids, until you then said, that's it, we have to stop, we have to go home.
I learned the hard way. When doing pictures in the ring, what I would do in the end was I would do an intermission. So pictures in the ring and intermission.
Right, okay.
When the show is over, if they like pictures with the same guy or a different wrestler, I would do it in the lobby and create a line in the lobby. Right. That way, the guys are getting all the ring down. So
no, I say you learned a lot as you went along. And initially, I used to always say to the wrestlers, look, if you have your own merchandise and you want to sell it, that's okay. I'm focusing on the show and promoting the show. But gradually through time, I learned that there's quite a bit of extra money can come from that to help cover the cost of the show, and I sort of moved into that. I remember also at one point I actually, because I used to do freelance journalism in my spare time, and I used to write for newspapers and magazines, so I actually had written my own program, and you put the photographs of the wrestlers on the show, and you got that printed, and you were selling it for £2 or £3, but you were printing so many that it was quite a bit of profit.
Do you know what's interesting? Programs. I used to print a fresh program. It used to be twice a year, then it was once a year. And I'd get like 10,000 done. And over the course of the year, I'd have them all sold. But by the end of it, when the Celtic Tiger in Ireland went bust, it was actually cheaper to go to a liquidator and buy boxes and boxes of magazines, wrestling magazines that never got sold.
Oh, right,
or
yes.
second-hand magazines. Yeah. And I'd actually sell them at the tables and have the wrestler sign them, and it would save a fortune on printing costs.
Right.
Because the programs I had were A4 and
something similar to what I was doing. I used to do like an A4 program, and if I was going to be doing maybe two sort of like shows or two sets of shows in the year, I would have worked out who was going to be in and made sure there was photographs. And then they would buy those, and then if they had nothing to sign, or some of the wrestlers weren't really into merchandising because they were only starting out, then the kids would get them to sign, the book. So it then became like a real souvenir brochure for them.
Those particular shows, I can remember, because no one was selling merch. Irish guys weren't selling merch. The only merch I sold really was some programs and T-shirts at that stage. Eventually, I had like a shop at the venues. So many different things.
Yeah, making more money from the merchandising than the show.
In some cases. But I always remember Matt Stryker. I came up at the end of the night, and the person I had with me, he started giving out saying I had more than that. And I learned that night to only take X amount of merchandise off each person, and say for each of them, say 28 by 10 or 5 T-shirts each. And then if they sell out, send someone back to get more. That way they can't say they've sold 10 T-shirts when realistically they've sold one.
Yeah.
So anyone watching, always count other people's merch count the items, and then you know what's sold.
Yeah, no, it's as I said, in the early days I didn't really get involved, but then I realised, particularly if you were doing if I was doing a tour for a week, you just sort of thought, that is a wee bit of extra money to help cover the costs.
Or what some people do is you have their own little concession stand with drinks and crisps and candy. I stopped doing it because I found out when you're not there, the wrestlers are coming along and drinking all day.
When nobody's watching it, and the next thing you realise you lost money on the drink stand, and it added an extra income level, and it was quite surprising for a little bit of effort. You actually could generate quite a bit. The one that always stood out was the Polaroids and the photographs in the ring. I used to always really think £5 was the going rate for that, and I used to always think that is just so easy to do, but yet generates quite a bit of extra revenue to help pay for the tour.
I always remember Jake Roberts. I was using him around that time when the tour we're talking about, and his queue during the intermission was massive. I say there's a couple of 250 people. Obviously couldn't get through them all, but at the time he had issues and he was drinking a lot and so forth, and we were doing a 50-50 split, and I went back to his hotel room and I was very honest. I had exactly what he was owed, and I went back at the end of the night, and he said, because I put his match on before the intermission, so we had these pictures during the intermission, and he gave me the envelope and it was said, do you want to count it? Oh no, it's fine, I trust you. So, I mean, if I wasn't an honest character, I could have took a lot more money out of that.
They wouldn't have known. Yeah, you did find that, I find with my experience of working with people, I was quite fortunate that the majority of people were fine, were good, very good to work with. They trusted you. If they had an issue, they could come and talk to you.
Not everybody. I know there's a name we have in common. Well, two names, Chris Daniels and Michael Modest. And the reason I mention these guys, they're kind of put together. They started out in California together. They were signed to WCW together. So technically, you booked them in Ireland, up here in Northern Ireland, before I even ran my first show.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Mike Modest is one of the nicest guys I've ever met in wrestling.
Would totally agree. Mike Modest was a real gentleman to work with, very easygoing, nothing was a bother, and he just got on with it. Very skillful in the ring, didn't always put on a good show, but outside of the ring, a real gentleman to talk to. Yeah, I totally would agree. He's a absolutely fantastic guy.
Just for anybody watching who isn't sure who Mike Modest is, if you see the movie Beyond the Mat, he's in a segment of that. Down in APW, gets a WWE tryout, and that's where he kind of got his fame from. Then he was in Pro Wrestling in Noah in Japan after that.
That's right, he was in Japan for quite a number of years actually. Quite
and I remember he started a promotion called Pro Wrestling Iron. So I remember he met Doug Williams, an English wrestler, on the Irish Whip shows, and then through there they made a contact, and that's how Doug in fact got him over to Noah. But that was Mike Modest being a nice guy, helping people out. But I'll always remember there was, I won't mention who the wrestler was, everyone was selling t-shirts, and there was one particular t-shirt that liked one of the guys. I said, could I have, bands and, I would swap t-shirts and clothing items, and I remember asking this particular wrestler, could I have one of your t-shirts? Charge me. So I purposely wouldn't pay for it, it's okay.
Yeah.
And I remember Mike Modest had such a good time, and I didn't mess him over. I paid him what he wanted. He actually told me to keep his merch money that he was treated. So I've never had a wrestler say to me,
that would have been Mike. Mike was, as I said, he was your real gentleman, very good, very easy to work with. And I think actually when you talked there about, with Doug Williams, I actually think he was on the same show that I had Doug Williams on, and that's probably why they might have actually he had sort of some connection, because I think Doug was on one of the shows that I had Mike on.
But Mike at the time wasn't in Norway.
Yeah.
So that's where he was mad to get that. So I remember putting the two of them in the same room together.
Yeah. But no, Mike was a real gentleman to work with, as was a lot of other guys that I worked with. But he was really very good and easy to work with.
A colleague, Mike Modest, told me a few years ago. I don't know how true it is, but in the movie Beyond the Mat, you see him, he has a tryout with the WWE in the day, and apparently he went longer in the match than he was. Now, this is anybody that has a tryout with WWE. This is a story you should take on board. So he was given, argument's sake, 5 minutes in the ring, him and his opponent, and apparently he went double that time or more by his own choice, and hence I was told by one of his colleagues that that's how he got blacklisted, blackballed by the WWE as such. So always do what a corporate employer wants you to do.
It's probably like anything, and sometimes businesses can be a bit ruthless, and you probably just have to go and do what they say, and stick to it. Otherwise, you end up on the blacklist.
One of those particular tours you brought in, Scotty Mac.
Yes, Scotty Mac.
Vancouver, I believe it's from.
Yeah.
Over in Canada. He's still running, as far as I know. So he came in, and there was 2 or 3 shows.
Yeah.
Sold on.
Yes, you had we had him on a few shows, and then I think obviously then we had some shows with yourself, and he was doing some other promotional stuff with me here. But I remember actually I have this sort of funny story. Was that the first, I think it was on a Friday night, was your first show, and we were driving down from the north into the south. You'd given me the directions to the venue, and I got totally lost. Sat nav wasn't a big thing in those days either. And wouldn't it be great if we were doing all these things now, how easily it would be able to do. But didn't have sat nav, was driving around Dublin, going round and round circles, absolutely lost. It was then getting to the stage where it was very close to the time of the show, and I think I had to eventually ring somebody and say, I'm lost, can you tell me where I'm supposed to be? But in actual fact, I wasn't that far away from the venue, but I was just going in a different direction. And eventually we got there in time for the show.
And the venue we're talking about is Mount Temple. Mount Temple it's a secondary school in Dublin. It's quite back in the day, it wasn't posh, it wasn't rough either, it was kind of a little bit in between, but that's where U2 met. So it's quite famous for Bono and The Edge and all them boys met there, and that's where they had their first band practices. So I thought that was quite cool, another part of it.
And the other thing was quite interesting with that is because when we found out, Scotty Mac was a big U2 fan, and he thought this was fantastic that he was performing wrestling in the school that they went to. And then, we were staying in Dublin for a couple of days while we were doing your other shows, so we did a bit of sightseeing because I don't if I can remember, he hadn't been to Ireland before. But we had to do the whole U2 tour, everywhere were U2. We did the U2 wall. We went to the hotel, is it the Clarence that the U2 owned? We had to go there. So I spent the whole weekend doing U2 stuff. And I hadn't the heart to tell him I hate U2.
And quite interesting little trivia, he made a girlfriend that weekend.
That's right, yes.
In Dublin.
Yeah, he did, yes.
Becky Lynch was his girlfriend that weekend. But I remember you were, and he stayed for friends. I think they were long what's the word? Not long-term couple.
Long-term relations. Long distance relationship. Yeah.
But they hooked up in Mount Temple, and I think Becky Lynch and him kind of. You were like the third wheel, I think.
Yes, yeah. I ended up just being the driver, But I say we had to do all these, sort of walking around doing the U2 tour, and then at times they went off and just did their own thing as young lovers do. But yeah, a very nice guy, very good wrestler.
To get back to Mount Temple, I ran a number of shows there, and I was thinking this would be the home base for shows on the north side of Dublin, and there was a nun who was part of the staff there. A sister of God, as they're called. So a sister of God is technically not a nun, but they can wear normal clothes. So she would always be complaining the music is too loud. But we've rented out the venue, music is too loud. Somebody's smoking outside. This person's chewing gum. And I remember one night somebody told her in a very unpolite way what to do with herself, and she was so offended, and then this person in particular stuck gum to the window of the main office, hence we were barred.
Oh right, that was the end of that.
We got barred out of Mount Temple.
Yeah.
U2 was...
Yes, I don't ever recall getting barred from anywhere. Not that I remember. But yeah, you did, when you went to certain venues, there was always sort of certain restrictions, and there were certain things you had to do. I remember, I think it might have been in the Bangor venue one time. They actually built, I think, they built the ring at one point, but didn't put protectors on the wooden
That was
floor.
me.
Was that you?
That was,
I was trying to think
remember
if it was somebody else, but never heard a word about it.
They put down a beautiful new floor. It was like a sponge.
Yeah, yes.
A very tight sponge, and it was obviously cost a lot of money. But I had that ring made by Frank Casey, the Midge.
Right.
We've mentioned him a few times. And the Midge is, he's a character. He's kind of unsavoury character. And there was all these problems, like I bought these aprons off when he turned up with Union Jack aprons. A nightmare, he forgot the aprons some other time. And I paid him all this in advance. So you'd always have to look over your shoulder. But anyway, he made me this ring, but he didn't put any base on the corner posts.
Right, okay.
And we had the show going on, all these men jumping around, and women. There was women on that show as well. And like a cookie cutter. Perfect 4 holes in the ground.
I forgot it was you, actually. I was trying to remember who it was, but I remember thinking to myself, on Monday morning I'm going to get a phone call and say you owe us £10,000 to replace the floor, but never heard a dicky bird to this day.
The guy came over to me and said, "Oh, the floor." I said, "Oh, it wasn't me, it was the ring. Who owns the ring?" And I said, "That's John." And he goes over to you, and I remember you going, pointing back at me.
Yeah. Well, it was probably one of those things that you sort of got to the stage where you think, they obviously put the wrong floor down.
The wrong ring.
But it could have been anything they put down, But
with 4 perfect holes.
I remember actually, I thought I definitely will get a phone call on Monday morning, but I never heard anything, so I thought that's fine. Me to this day.
I actually only barred it with 2 venues ever. Once was the Mount Temple, and Ireland only has one holiday camp. England has Haven, Butlins, Mosley. You've like scores of them, the same in the States and other countries. Ireland has one, and that's down in Cork. So I had a deal where I sold shows to them each and every week during the summer. And Whiplash TV, season 1, I think it is. Yeah, season 1. We've some TV shows come from there. So we travelled all the way down, and they were paying me a fee to put the show on. So I was, and it depends what time of the year it was. Sometimes you get 500 people in there squeezed in. But one particular night, we had 500 people squeezed in. And we were doing a battle royale. Now, it's my fault I put the battle royale on. And I said, lads, when you're going out with the ring, go towards the stage, or go towards where the biggest gap is. But don't go to the left and right where people are squashed in. So what do the lads do? 2 of them? Not only do you throw one over the ring, but the other one does a jump
into the crowd.
Into the crowd and hit some kid, smashes his knee of the kid in the ground. And I was just, oh my God, I have to tell him not to do it.
Yeah.
And I was barred. And never bought. They paid cash, and you sold a lot of merchandise. And of course, I gave out to the guy, and Rochford has a reputation of giving out to people, but they can't see why. Like.
Yeah. No, it's you do find. Say I didn't really have any significant issue with venues, but I have heard similar stories of promoters where they had issues, or sometimes we were run out of town. In fact, one of the times when I was sort of starting to potentially do some shows initially with Ori Williams we talked about, and I'd gone a couple of times. He used to do the summer season around Northern Ireland, so likes of Newcastle, Bangor, Portrush. He would have had a week-long summer tour. So at one point I actually went and met up with him to have some discussions, and I remember actually I didn't really know anybody who was on his shows, and I wasn't really there to meet them, but I remember I was doing a magazine. I was writing for a magazine at the time, and I said to him, I'm thinking of putting on some wrestling shows, blah blah blah. And the guy said, all right, do an interview, interview one of the wrestlers and we'll stick it in the magazine. And I said, well, okay. So I phoned Oric and I said, Oric, can I speak to one of the guys, do an interview with them, And he said, yeah, do you know any of them that's on it? And I said, well, really, I don't know who you have on. And he says, well, probably the most popular one that I have on this tour is Danny Boy Collins, So lo and behold, I went off and I ended up interviewing Danny Boy Collins. And, the next time when I was actually doing my tour, which is really what I wanted, was some of the wrestlers who were going to be on the tour I was going to do with them, Danny Boy Collins was never on, so I had this story about Danny Boy Collins. I thought, what are we going to do about it? Because I'm not going to keep it to promoting my shows, So I ended up just getting it published in the magazine anyhow. And then they had done a week-long tour of Northern Ireland. So what I did was then I was able to get the story in all the local magazines, like a review of the show with an interview with Danny Boy Collins. So it worked to my advantage.
For people watching, Danny Boy Collins was like the English Shawn Michaels.
Yes,
back in the 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah.
Very excellent technical wrestler, babyface, very good looking. It's amazing all these names that people, I know, and you probably still remember them in England, but maybe in other parts of the world they've never heard of wrestlers such as Danny Boy Collins, who was tremendous.
And it was, you know, I did the interview, but as I say, my original thing was, okay, I want to do this because I'm going to use Orig for shows and some of these wrestlers will be on the show, so I'll use that as my marketing publicity, and it backfired. So when I did the shows with him, he actually had nobody from that tour, but it was obviously, like anything, he was contracting different people in, you know.
Over the years, in the early days, I dealt a lot with Scott Conway and Brian Dixon. Scott would have done more tours, whereas Brian Dixon had a regular full-time routine, shows almost every day, if not every day.
Yes.
So I remember Gangrel used to do a lot of work for Orig Williams and Brian Dixon, and whenever I tried to book certain talent off Brian, he'd say no, because obviously they work for Orig and he's doing Ireland as well. So that's understandable. And then sometimes I would get guys, maybe if they're over Scott Conway, we'd work a deal out. But people don't seem to remember, outside of British wrestling, and Orig Williams, Scott Conway, Brian Dixon, three influential people in British wrestling from the 90s anyway. Brian Dixon, I think he's retired these days.
I think he retired just before COVID. I think he retired, but the business is still running, but I'm not sure.
I think James Mason, who was another British wrestler, worked for it.
Yeah, probably. I know he's retired, but I wasn't sure who had taken over. But I know they're still running.
Son-in-law, Dean Allmark. Have you heard of him?
Yes, I've heard of him because I think he's on the main roster for what would have been Brian's old promotion. So yeah, probably he's involved in running it.
It's gas. People are only talking about him now in the last few years, but he's been around for a long time.
Yeah, he was actually around when obviously Brian was doing his shows in the early days. You know, he was around, but I say the names only come to the surface recently. You know,
and it's funny because I remember asking the likes of Brian Scott if they've ever had shows back in the 80s, but it was always Northern Ireland. They've had shows. It was in Northern Ireland. It was never down here.
Yeah, well, I remember reading. It was around the time I was actually looking to get into a partnership with one of the English promoters to do shows here. And Orig, I had never come across Orig Williams at that point, but it was mostly the people I had contacted was Brian Dixon, Scott Conway, and there was also I can't remember his first name, but the guy Crabtree. From
Max Crabtree.
Max Crabtree. I remember speaking to him quite a few times because he was still running shows, but very nice guy to deal with. But he was basically starting to retire from the business.
So Max Crabtree was Big Daddy's
brother, yeah. But he was basically wanting to retire, so he wasn't really wanting to get involved. But again, a very nice, very knowledgeable guy, obviously. But I remember he said, no, I'm sort of like going to be retiring soon, so I don't really want to be getting involved. But then I say it was Brian Dixon initially that I sort of had thought about working with, but then it transpired then that I eventually did my first contacts with Orig Williams, who I think I got the contact from Brian. And then later on, I actually then had the dealings with Scott Conway, for future, after that. But obviously that was pre-catching up with yourself.
And then obviously, wrestling.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, it was good to be able to work collaboratively locally, but also, to bring some of the new talent, that was starting to come out here.
So, we had a lot of shows. I'm trying to think time-wise years. So you stopped around, I remember you stopped around 2005, 2006.
Yeah, 2005, 2006 is when I sort of stopped doing shows, because I think around that time I had quite a bit of PR work, other PR work that I was doing. I also then, I think around that time, I obviously have another job as well, and working for the government. So I was actually in a job that was taking up more of my time than I had for doing my PR stuff. And then also, wrestling started to decline a little bit. So there wasn't really, when I did a few shows, the numbers were starting to go down. And it was the same with my, music business stuff that I used to do. Everything started to go downwards,
That's interesting, because that's around 2005, 2006, but I didn't notice a decline until around 2009.
Right.
And it's basically the same country, and it's 3 years of a gap.
No, I sort of seen it sort of starting to decline a little bit, and I thought, okay, this isn't as profitable, and I sort of then, my plan was just to move out of it for a while and just do the other things that I was busy with, and then I was still keeping my ear to the ground and following things and stuff like that there. And then I had probably around that time I had some informal chat with an American promoter about trying to get them a television deal in the UK, and I did some background work on that.
Before we go, so in part one, John spoke about in his business that he had, his PR business marketing company. He was in talks with the XWF, who were popular for 6 months or a year.
I think they lasted.
So he was trying to get them a TV deal as a wrestling bit of business beyond live events. And then in 2005, 2006 happened again with TNA, wasn't it?
Yeah, I happened to be in America, and I met up with a guy, Shane Douglas, who worked for TNA, and I was having a chat with him, and they were obviously looking to get a UK platform.
Just before you go on, John, so prior to 2005, TNA were on the wrestling channel, but the wrestling channel then went out of business in 2005 or so on. So then they had nothing else left.
They didn't have a UK vehicle or a UK platform to put their show on, so they were looking for something new. I just happened to be in America, met a few of the officials there, had a chat with the guy Shane Douglas, and we sort of think, like anything, I don't never say I can do anything for them, but I said obviously if we want, we can have a look at it, and I had some informal chats with them, and it just didn't really go anywhere.
So when you met up with them, was this while you were in Florida or in Nashville?
I was in Florida, actually. I think I was in Florida on holidays, and they happened to be there because that's where they used to film. I think, was it in Universal Studios they used to? I think it was Universal Studios. They had they used to do a weekly show there. But the next day they were going back to Nashville for something. So they said, okay, we haven't had a chance to talk to you. Come down to Nashville. So I went down and had a chat with Shane Douglas. And we did have some exchange of emails and things like that, trying to, put together a package that would be on offer, and then it just really fell flat. It didn't really go anywhere.
And was that a case of, do you think he didn't feel there was a deal there, or do you feel it was higher up?
Well, it's it's hard to know because it just fiddled out. Nothing came of it. I don't know whether maybe they thought they were going to get a deal and they'd already maybe had some discussions with something else, but it just never materialised. And then eventually they did get a UK channel.
That was Bravo. 2008 maybe.
That was
Bravo.
2008. I think they got there and they went on to Bravo.
Interesting part with you, John. So for you with TNA, with that deal, you weren't looking to run TNA live events. You were just looking to make a percentage of sales.
Yeah, it was just probably to see if there was the possibility if they got a TV deal, and then obviously there would be some arrangement, for me being involved in that, But it never materialised. It never happened.
TNA, sidebar again. So tryouts with the WWE. I know it was at a TV tape, and any of the Irish guys, Irish Whip guy or guys or lads in general, they would get paid for being over the TV tape and they get fed.
Yeah.
So forth. You used to just do them at the house shows. And I always remember the Irish Whip guys, when we got tryouts with the TNA, the first year they wanted to charge the guys to do the tryout. And then they wanted them to do the ring van, as in help the ring up and down. And I just thought that was disgraceful. And I remember the second year when the lads went back, I'm trying to think who the middleman was the second time we went back. But I remember saying that the lads aren't paying. And, if they're going to do the ring crew, they're going to they had a cage match on the second time. Oh yeah, they'll get paid and they'll get fed. They got fed leftovers, I think it was, and they never got paid. So when they came around the third time, they wanted the Irish Whip guys to answer. No.
Yeah. No, it's probably like anything, sometimes when you have, especially a new company and it's set up and it's obviously trying to grow, and you probably at times you heard money was tight and they weren't spending money on certain things, but they were spending money on other things
owned by billionaires and
and you just sort of think to yourself, well, are they really committed to this, or is it like you think about some of those football clubs that are owned by billionaires and you think that's just a hobby. I sense that there was a real enthusiasm from the people who are on the ground in the company. And they obviously were interested in a UK deal. But
what they charged for live events was, as in, so if you were to buy the show off them, I inquired, I won't say the chap's name, he wasn't a wrestler, but he worked in the office. They had sold shows on, I've heard what they were charging some guys up in the States and Canada. And I inquired about it here, but the same thing, like I said, with other groups in the past, they want a lump sum, a percentage of tickets, or percentage of each ticket sale after a certain amount. And you pay for flights to come. It was, and TNA, I knew they wouldn't draw the numbers. And when they came here the first time, I think they sold out the first time. That was a couple of years later. Then after that, I don't know. I don't think they ever made money at live events in Ireland.
Yeah, no, they didn't tour that often, to be quite honest, over here. And again, if you're going to do something like that, you're going to have a higher profile, and you're going to have that television network. I also remember at the time when they were coming over, it was quite interesting that at times one of their rivals, not mentioning any names, the rivals would have actually toured more frequently. They used to do this at times. They would have toured more frequently, and it was basically to try and wipe out the competition, and obviously it worked because they didn't come back.
Yeah, I know they ran the National Stadium and they would use MCD as a regional promoter.
Yeah.
Whereas WWE used Aiken, who was the more...
That's right, yeah.
Now, obviously the two of them are top class regional promotions groups, but the best out of the two was Aiken, and that's who WWE went with. And I'll never forget, they sold out the stadium, which is like 2,000 seats. Then they decided the next year, what's the next year or the last year, they were going to do the second year, the main arena that WWE does, and you got like 1,500 people in a 9,500 seat arena.
Yeah, no, as I say, it just, you need, when you're going to aim for a 9,000 seater arena, you really need to know you have your profile and you've got your fan base. And
as sidebar, and then we'll get back to the wrestling. I remember at one of the shows, I don't remember which one it was, but Ric Flair, people thought about Ric Flair, he was a legend and so forth, but Ric Flair was there, and you always hear the story about how he shakes everybody's hands, or you shake everybody's hands, but it was quite weird. It was a very heavy environment that day, but Ric Flair obviously was in a very bad humour. You could just see it. He was urgent to fight. I remember saying that, don't go near him. He's obviously in bad humour, don't go near him, but he was going around like chomping at the bit, and then the story came out that he had a problem with, he was ever at blame, where he wanted an advance. So at the Dublin show, he decided that was it. He was going home and he was leaving. But that was at that particular show in Dublin, where he had a fallout with TNA management. But that was quite intense backstage. And I was a bit disappointed because, obviously, he's a legend. You want to say hello to him, but I just knew if one of us went near him, he'd probably just, because I heard some stories about when he was wrestling for groups in England, he was in bad humour, how he would react giving out. Yeah. So I just said,
no, it's sometimes you hear people saying, actually, if you have an idol or somebody that you look up to in a whatever, never meet them.
No, just regarding to Ric Flair, you could tell he was in bad form. I'm sure the guy's a gentleman, a lovely man. He has a great legacy. I didn't mean that in a bad way against Rick just that particular day, but there is a story talked about at the time how he left the tour early. He was sent home or he left, but we were there that particular day and it was very intense, and somebody was nearly going to get a punch in the face from Ric Flair. That's the way it looked. But Ric Flair story again, Brian Dixon used Ric Flair's son, Richie Steamboat, I get mixed up. Rick Steamboat's son, Richie was his name. So he used him, and then I know he'd used Brian Dixon had used Ric Flair's son after that as well. So Brian Dixon, I used to be in contact with Brian Dixon and this and that and talent and whatnot. And I remember on a show in Dublin, or Ireland, Jerry Ryan show, the radio show, that used to be the most popular radio station state in Ireland. And Ric Flair was an interview on it because he was coming over for the WWE tour. And he blasted Brian Dixon. My son is treated badly over there in England. Talking about Brian Dixon. And anyway, I'm talking to Brian Dixon about a week later. So Brian, Ric Flair was on the interview here and he was shocked. He's like, I'm so good to his son, David Flair. I'm treated this way. so it's mad how in wrestling people perceive things one way compared to what it really is, or vice versa. Like.
Yeah, and sometimes actually what you find, isn't it, it's like every walk of life is, it's just miscommunication. They don't really, you know, they've got this issue, but they don't tell you about it, you know. And you know, I seen it so many times, you know. When you were doing shows, you know, you had some guys excellent, really good to work with, and then you just had the prima donnas who you just sort of thought, I can't be bothered with this. Yeah. Can you please just go away home?
But unfortunately, the prima donnas sometimes are the students there now.
Yeah.
Up as far as the main event. So
it just, you know, and you see it, and then again it's back to, you know, they could have got out of bed the wrong side, you know, or something like, or somebody rattled them, you know, and you just have to take the rough with the smooth. But I have to say, most of the time when I was doing tours, you know, I majority of the time I had a great bunch of guys that was working on them.
So so here we are, John, 2005, 2006. You took a break from wrestling, and I know you're trying to get that TV deal with TNA for a group in the UK. But besides that, you kind of vanished from wrestling. Like,
yeah, I moved away from the wrestling and got into my other work that I was doing and focused on that for a while. You know, then we obviously went into the credit crunch. So there was basically nothing really happening.
It was a tough time, actually.
You know, and we, you know, I know in every country it was tough in the credit crunch, but probably in Northern Ireland, we really didn't have although we started with the credit crunch, we really didn't, and I'm probably talking more about our politicians than anybody else, but we really didn't think and realise we had a credit crunch to 2015. So 2015 became the credit crunch again for us, even though the rest of the world. So during that period, there was quite a lot of uncertainty, and it was just a very challenging time for doing shows and doing things. Even in my music work I used to do, it all dropped. You know, people weren't coming over here anymore. There was just no money. So I literally dropped out of it for a while, and then sort of came back for a short period of time. When I did a couple of further shows.
I remember in between, obviously I've either promoted shows or sold shows all over Northern Ireland, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. For me as well, where I had the most shows, when you look at it really, is Antrim and Down.
Yeah. Which
was like your region. And when you weren't running at that stage, I remember running in Down and Antrim a lot. And Nerdy Town Hall, I would have brought into like various shows, Balls Mahoney, Tracy Smothers, Kid Cash. And it was weird because to me, I always looked at, when I do Nerdy or Down in general, I'd normally just sell the shows on to you. But you weren't doing it. It was weird. Like
I was away for a while. But I hadn't gone away, you know, as we would say sometimes.
But you were talking there about Northern Ireland. And again, I know what happened in Northern Ireland first, and then it came in down south around 2009. People were spending less and it was tough.
Yeah.
But remember running the theatres, and obviously the theatres are expensive, but it's kind of handy as well. Up in Northern Ireland, they help to advertise the show, whereas down south they don't.
Yeah.
You sell your tickets. You know, it's nice and relaxed about, and it's more professional when you're in the theatre. But as time went on, I noticed that up in Northern Ireland, when I did Nerdy, I didn't do the town hall anymore. I did smaller venues like that as well. Yeah. People just weren't spending.
Yeah, but that's what I was saying. You know, the numbers started to go down, and mostly I always used to do the shows in leisure centres, which were good venues, as you say. They had a good setup, good structure. They did the ticketing. You normally would have got the revenue coming in quite quickly, if you're obviously paying the bills. So that they were quick at doing that. Although I did have one experience where one particular took weeks, nearly months to pay the bill, and it was like going, am I ever going to get this money? So you have all that drama. But yeah, they were very good venues, but the size of them, it just wasn't profitable. So that's why I sort of then moved out for a while.
And unfortunately, with some of these venues, if some of them hold 500, and you're not going to get 500, you're aiming 250, maybe, realistically, maybe 300. You're still technically paying for the 500 seat venue, even though you're not going to get those.
That's it. Like for example, Bangor was 1,000, Newry was 1,000, Downpatrick was capacity of 600, but when you put the ring in, it reduced it down to 400. But you knew you weren't going to get those numbers at that time. Just it was, again, like every business, it goes up for a while, then it goes down. In my opinion, it was down at that time, and because I had so many other things that I was doing, it wasn't profitable to do them.
It really is. Well, like I said, it happened to me down south as well. But I used to do shows every year in the town hall in Warrenpoint, which is kind of, would that be, it's just past Newry, but Kilkeel and Newry, between there. It's
in between.
And I just how that went down. You could see it like packed, not as good a crowd, half a crowd, quarter of a crowd to where empty.
Yeah.
As each year went by, and just people just weren't spending.
Yeah. You had that, and obviously, people said, oh, it was just a credit crunch for 1 year, but it wasn't really. It started around 2008, 2009, but for us, it went right up to 2015, and there really wasn't money around, so people weren't going out as much, they weren't socialising, and probably, they weren't going to spend money on a ticket to see a wrestling show, which probably would have had to put the price up to try and cover your costs, so they weren't going to do that, especially if it was family, so it was just easier to take a little bit of a break for a while just to see.
And the way you're describing there as well, what's interesting, people don't realise when you're putting tours on, accommodation, you're trying to provide accommodation. Now, I used to live in the Midlands, and at the time I lived in a relatively big house, so people could stay there.
Yeah.
But when you're not in that region, or you're not within an hour and a half drive each way, you're paying for hotels.
Yeah.
And that in itself, even the accommodation bill can be quite expensive.
Well, if you take, for example, you've got just say 10 wrestlers on a show, and you're traveling around and you can't get back to your base, to accommodate them, because I used to have some of the guys used to stay at my house and other family or friends' houses to keep the cost down. But if you were doing that, 10 people in a hotel, some of them want a hotel room of their own, which is £100 a night. So there's £1,000 for the night just for your accommodation. Now, then you add in all your other costs, so it just becomes, too expensive, and if you know that you're not going to get the numbers, then it just does become...
I shouldn't be laughing, but I had towns that were doing the west of Ireland, and when the money's not there in certain communities, when the big towns and the cities, it's different. But I would put on I'd have 3 wrestlers, or I could have 4 wrestlers, so I'd have 2 matches, intermission, and come back with a tag. And those people in those little communities didn't mind. You might only have 120 people, but because you're doing so many of them, two a day, you're making money off them.
Yeah.
Whereas if you did that in the bigger city, you couldn't. You just...
Yes, it just wouldn't work because, you're really looking at making sure you can try and put on a 2-hour show within a very short interval. But if you've got only 4 people, it's very difficult to stretch it out.
People, they're working twice. They can tell. Now this is where storytelling comes in.
Yeah.
Good story leads up the last match for intermission. The bad guy wins because you're the bad guy. Help them. Faces win. The good guys win. And tag match at the end. But lads just don't know how to tell a story. It's all about they want to do. Not all lads. That's a few. I'm not putting people down here by any means. So wouldn't you have lads that can tell a story or sell merch for you? So you're like, lads, intermission, blah blah. Get people in the ring. I need this done, that done. I want the kids to get into the ring for a reason to tell the ref and the good guy, you're cheated. I could see the guy cheating. Well, it's going to cost €10 to get into the ring and get a picture and tell him. But then guys wouldn't come out to cheat on time, and it's money out of your pocket at the end of the day. Like they still want to be paid.
Well, that's where, as I say, if they're not really, engrossed in the business and trying to help you grow, then that's where it becomes difficult, because you say you're there, put on. I always think you're there to put on a good show, but you're also there to make money, because that's really what it's all about. When you get to the stage where you're putting on a tour for a week, you want to make money at the end of it. If you broke even, which sometimes you did, that was fine because you didn't lose, but you were there to try and make some money, but put on the best show you can for everybody. But you got, as you said, you got people coming in and they were just no enthusiasm. Even sometimes when they got into the ring, you found they couldn't be arsed, and yourself, the audiences pick up on that. They pick up on that.
I used to find, if I used a regional promoter, let's say I'm over in Sligo, so it's hard to get there. So if you're doing certain tours, you go, right, if you use somebody there and you think, right, I'm going to give you a percentage of the profit, and they're just happy to be on a show.
Yeah.
And you find out, there was one guy in Leitrim one time I ran a show, and he put a couple of guys up in his house, and the lad said they found more or less all the posters and flyers in his room. So God knows he put 5 even posters out, and the show had 40 people, 45 people. And I remember, how could this show, where it's deprived for entertainment, and there you go, he was just happy to be on the show. So they don't care if you're making money or not. They just have their family and friends there.
Yeah, if they can actually say, "Oh, I was on the show," or "I helped at the show," that's fine. But as you say, you're there to have 300 or 400 people at least, And
you feel like you're letting yourself down by dealing with people of that caliber.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you're just trying to turn a profit and keep in business.
Yeah. So it's like anything, If I was focused on the show, like when I first got into the business, I didn't know, oh, right, okay, I have to do all these poster runs. Then you have to go around and do them again, so you're spinning around and round and round in circles sometimes. But then you sort of think, but that's part and parcel of it.
So, John, I think this leads into what we're going to talk about. So when you kind of did your last shows, it was around 2010.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to touch on is, one, you had a sponsorship, how you got it was a big level sponsorship. And two, we'll go into after that how generous you were with beverages and drinks, and people took advantage. But so 2010, the cricket club in Downpatrick, you got big time sponsorship for that.
Yeah, I was doing a bit of what they call sort of sports promotion, and getting people interested in sport. So I was sort of doing a little, it wasn't little actually, it was a conference on it. And I was trying to come up with some ideas for, the entertainment, for people. And I thought, no, my business was in the past was wrestling, so I'll put on a couple of wrestling shows. So we incorporated wrestling into the conference, and the first night we did of the tour it was for 2 nights. It was basically open to Joe Public. Public could come into it. Got all the guys, got yourselves all involved. Got some guys over from England. Very much having a European feel to it. So I had some people from Austria, France, and Italy. And that was a concept too. I wanted to try and promote European wrestling. Because it was, as we said earlier, it was quite big across Europe, and then all of a sudden it started to decline, but wanted to do a bit of promotion on that. But then the second night I thought, well, I just can't do the same thing on the second night, because it's going to be in the same venue. So, whoever's going to come to the show will come on the first night, but being a small area, they're not going to come back on the second. So I was sitting watching a movie one night, and it was an old political film that was on about the 30s, and the rise of fascism and all this here, and they showed you this corporate political meeting or get together in London. But in the film, it was like a corporate white collar dinner, but their entertainment during the dinner was wrestling. And I thought, that's a great idea. I like that idea. So I filtered that into the second day of this sports sort of themed conference, and we did the white collar. So it was a corporate dinner, Everybody invited, and then they came, and the entertainment was the wrestling.
It was either a 3-course or a 4-course meal, wasn't it?
I think it was 4-course if you count the shortbread at the end, or coffee and biscuits or whatever it was they got at the end. So it was a 4-course meal, but the entertainment for the night was wasn't a band or music. It was wrestling,
Action theatre.
Action theatre, yeah.
You bought the shows. And on top of that, you brought in some of your own talent from Austria, Germany, Italy, France, Bosnia. Yeah, that's the 5. So it was very much European feel. And then I had brought up guys from Ireland, Northern Ireland, and I actually hadn't that tour with me at the time in the south. I brought him up was a guy called Sugar Dunkerton.
Yes, I remember the American guy.
Guy, and he later became Pineapple Pete in AWA or AEW. He had a feud with Chris Jericho on TV so he's famous for like a month as Pineapple Pete, but it was a character that stuck. So he was on John's, a tour from mine, but these shows John's talking about was on them as well as Sugar Dunkerton, a basketball gimmick. But he thought that was pretty amazing. Just being, he thought we did that all the time. This was the first time. Actually, I remember sort of talking to a few people and I think I found out afterwards that it had never been done in Ireland before that format. So or since,
you know. So I sort of thought actually that was quite good, quite interesting, quite different.
Here we are in the cricket club, which as a venue, like you would think a cricket club, who has a show in the cricket club? But the venue was perfect. What wrestling was. I had a full gym for everybody. We were there for 2 days. I had a bar. I had everything in it. Yes. And through the sponsorship that you had and the funding, to me, I could see where you were being generous.
Yeah.
You were feeding people.
Yeah.
Drinks. But people took advantage of that. Really took advantage of that, like of your generosity. And again, it's not just with you. I've seen it myself when you try to be, especially old school wrestlers or people, they see it as a sign of weakness when you're giving them a few drinks, giving them a meal.
Yeah.
If you give them a meal, they'll want to start. If you give them a starter and a meal, they want the dessert, you know. Story. So when I ran Force 2002, I was used to a little rider with entertainment. But some of them might want a case of beer, or whatever, you know. But wrestlers, when there's a rider, they just think everything is free.
Yeah.
So I got stung back in 2002 and I said, I won't let that happen to me again, like, you know. With stuff like that. And I remember there was a well-known former ECW wrestler that you had over. I've had a few, I won't name which one it was. And I left instructions like that the hard way. Now, sometimes you might get a deal in a hotel where you include breakfast.
Yes.
Some might include one meal. If that is part of the deal I make with them, brilliant. If not, it's just accommodation. This one particular guy ran up a bill. It wasn't as large as that by any means. But I just remember getting a phone call a couple of days later. We have an outstanding bill here from the particular wrestler, and I was thinking, you know, there really are some of them you couldn't trust them as far as you push them, like, you know.
No, I'd say I would probably say 99% of the people I worked with were very, very good, but you always got the one, you know. They were either quite dramatic in dealing with you, or in that case, and probably knew fine rightly when they were checking out that they had a bill, you know, which should have been paid, and why they walked off, I just never understood.
So we'll call your last shows the cricket shows.
The cricket shows.
Shows.
Yeah.
So, like I said, the first night went to the Chinese, and you paid for 3-course meal in the Chinese, like, which is really 2-course. The third course was just more drink. But some people really took advantage, and I remember telling the Irish guys, don't. You know, I've sold a number of shows on to John. I want to do it again. Do not take advantage, like, you know. But one particular group were doing it, and the other group saw it, and then they started doing it, like, you know? So
it's like nearly like the sheep are following each other, you know?
They're looking at you as like a mark that has all this money just to try. They didn't look at it. I saw that as there was funding. So you're spending the funding, everything's accounted for. That's where you spend the funding on. Like,
it's like anything, you know. I'm always, when it comes to doing things like that, I'm always very much in the business side of things, you know. So, you know, if it had got to the stage where I said, you know, this is just not on, I would easily have turned around and said, look, I'm sorry, that's it. But
that's what I'm saying.
You're on your own.
You put a trust in people.
Yeah.
That I'm providing you not only a meal, but meals. We got breakfast the next day.
Yeah.
Remember, you paid for breakfast for everybody. You brought us in. So really a nice 3-course Chinese, a few beers, breakfast the next day. That day in the cricket club, got a couple. Well, I wasn't drinking that till that night. Some days had a couple of beers, some coffees, and then we had that meal that night. I mean, I've never gotten that for anyone I've sold shows to ever.
It's like anything I had. You know, probably the way the event was, the 2 shows were being run, I had a very good budget for it, and probably, to be fair, money wasn't an object. The first night we had generated, ticket sales as well as the event.
But
being
before
covered.
you even sold one ticket,
I was on that sort of profit margin before we even started. So like the ticket sales, for example, was a bonus, but we decided to do that because we just sort of thought there was certain people, wanted to go, but would be normally a wrestling fan would pay. So we did that. But we also, we give some complimentary tickets. We give some away as competition prizes and stuff like that. But it was more, I knew what I had and what I could spend. But if the money tap had run out, the money tap would have been closed. So probably like anything, in some cases people will see that and take advantage of it,
Before we finish up, we'll just tell a couple of more stories about the cricket shows. The concept was great, the meal, the 3-course meal. And I can remember, I asked you what kind of card you wanted, but you wanted the same card both nights because they're 2 complete. Guys and only American. They were doing different stuff in the match, like like they were adapting. But I found the mainland European guys, the Austrians and the Germans and the Bosnian guy, they just, and it was a French guy actually, and the French guy was good. Fabian Archer.
Yes, he's Fabian Archer now, but he was Tristan Archer back then.
I always get mixed up.
I think he goes by that name now, but he was Tristan Archer back there. Back in those days, very, very good.
I think he wrestled on the WWE. He had a cruiserweight special or something.
That's right, he did. He was over. I think he was over in America for maybe a year on a tryout with them, but then he obviously came back, so I'm not sure.
So he was French, and I remember he came in the second night around, and good. And then there was a guy called Shock, he was
the Italian guy, yes, the
nice
Italian wrestler.
But no, I know Italy at the time and France weren't really doing that many shows, whereas now it's different. Or I know you had your in France in particular group, but the Austrian guys, the German guys were on a world of their own.
Yes,
they looked fabulous, excellent shape, but they seemed to be like they just wrestled for an exhibition. And it was something like, do they not do crowd work? But obviously they've been doing it a long time. They were the main events each night, and that you wanted, and you understand because they were the biggest guys in the best shape, and I just thought it was so cheesy. Their particular match,
when you sort of, at the time you always think everything was wonderful and everything was great, but again when you sit back,
and it was a great weekend and they were great nights.
Yeah, when you sit and think back, to the different matches, and you then could see the different styles of wrestling you were getting from different people, and probably comes across now watching it, it looks a bit stale, and then there was a times you sort of thought this is really, really good, but I think yes, it was just to try and show different styles, I think one of the Austrian guys was probably more of a trainee, so there was sort of like some clumsy scenes,
There was clumsy scenes, and everyone has, but they had this arrogance about them, like they were like millionaire superstars. And I remember everybody, or a prime example, the second night they were in the main event again, and I remember everybody, I don't like guys coming out onto the floor to watch the shows because it takes away from what's going on in the ring, people looking back. But this particular night, they said, look, we'll hide up behind where the spare table and chairs are and look through. And that's what the whole dressing room came out and hid this little area away from everybody. And they're looking just to see how bad their match was. And I have a clip of it, and they're in shock that the crowd aren't getting behind this match. That's boring, like, you know.
You know, it's probably, you know this yourself, you know, once you would start a match, you know, and obviously I've never actually been wrestling in a ring myself, but I, you know, from just talking to people, once you get into that ring, you're really looking to feed off the crowd to help you, you know. And there was at times, you know, they were like, it was nearly like you were thinking, God, are we going home yet? Is it finished? You know, you know, so that then becomes, you know, back on reflection later on in years, you think to yourself, well, yeah, it wasn't a good match from the perspective of entertaining.
That's what I love about people underrate the English wrestlers. Whether the old school boys, or Danny Collins or Drew McDonald's, but a lot of the new guys now who are doing like the Brian Dixon shows, the camps, are really, really good. They're excellent. So the English guys were great on it as well. Like the crowd work. There was one particular guy during the meal jumping out and taking people's fork, pretending he's going to, you know, as a foreign object. Really getting the crowd into it. Doing a brilliant job. And this guy, he was the champion of his home promotion back in Austria, was working as a bad guy, but he was a good guy in his head. Like, and it was just. It was actually, for us, it was hilarious to watch this. Yeah,
the dynamics of the match, you know, and you get to the stage where, you know, I always work on the basis that, you know, you're looking obviously to put on, you know, a really, really good show that's from start to finish that the audience love, and if you can captivate the audience from start of the show to the end of the show, you're on a winner. And there was a time you thought, well, that's not one I would be doing again. You know, I'll take that one out. And then sometimes I found actually, on when I was doing shows in the past years ago, that a match that you didn't think, you know, that would be as good as what you had imagined turns out to be spectacular, and you think, God, I never would have thought of that match would have went down so well, you know.
On the male night, obviously, even though it's the same card, it had to be done different because you have a match or two to warm them up. Then you have your starter, maybe it's having to start in between another match, and they're trying to explain to guys, look, it's not like a normal show, match after match after match.
Yeah.
Let them get their meal served to them first, so nobody's missing out. The waiters are all off the floor, you know. I'm trying to explain that to some of the guys. They were taking it very personally, thinking like, oh, well, it's not going to ruin anything. You're dictating to the audience.
Yes, yeah.
How the night's going to go.
Your match is going to still be the same, but it might be in a time frame to fit in with something else. And
even if there's a gap of 10 minutes between the matches, doesn't matter. Yeah. They're getting the food served, they're going to the toilet, they're coming back, while they're having the meal, they're going to watch what's happening. So it was actually...
No, really if I was... the one thing I thought about, actually, and I say that, and obviously, you know, planned to look at, was that if I was going to be doing shows in the future, is that I would like to look at that concept again, but probably more for like a charity corporate event, you know, where you basically sell the show to a charity and you say, right, okay, you sell this at £50 a head for a meal and the wrestling, and you turn it into, you know, because charities, you know, particularly, you know, right across Ireland and probably UK, they're chomping at the bit to find something else to raise money, you know, and I sort of thought I might, if I was going to do shows again, I would take that concept, but I would turn it into more of a charitable thing where I would sell the tickets to charities.
Yes, a great idea. Sure, look, we can talk about that off camera. So, look, John, I appreciate this. We've had such a long interview that it's been in two parts.
Good crack reminiscing about the past.
But it's historical. So you're the first interview of this type that I've done. And again, it's not a series of a thing. It's to get the history of Irish wrestling that people either forgot about, don't know about, or should know about. Or people might pick a few things up here, regardless if it's in America, Australia, Israel, or up the road in Northern Ireland.
And see what we're doing in this small island.
Or what we have done.
Yeah.
But no, I appreciate the business over the years, buying the shows. Some of the guys that you brought in off your own back that I used down here. I mean, it was great. Look, stressful at times, but
it's you know, I probably would, you know, as you sort of get older, you always think to yourself, you look back and see what things you did, and I always look back and think, you know, I really had a blast doing those shows. yes, there was a bit of stress now and again, but sure, we get that with everything we do. So I really enjoyed not just all the stuff I did in wrestling, but all the stuff I did with PR, even writing, magazines and for magazines and newspapers. But wrestling was something that I probably didn't start out to do, but I eventually got into it. And when I did get into it, I really did enjoy it. And I'm, very grateful to be able to work with people like yourself throughout those years, who actually helped me, achieve those shows.
So we have created history. The whole point of this is to show history, talk about the history we've made and things we've done. So I'm proud of that, and I'm sure you're very proud of what you've achieved.
Definitely, indeed, yes.
And again, unfortunately, the pandemic put things up in the air, but I'm sure we both found success in other areas of our life. So I don't know, it's being tempted back into wrestling is, if it will, I won't really, isn't it?
It's one of those things where I'm always a great believer in. I'll never say never, because you never know. You might get involved and get the buzz back again and go in that direction. And again, if the opportunity comes, I might have a look at it and see what happens.
But regardless of that, you've promoted shows all over Northern Ireland. Your tours, you did your 8-day tour. I know I used to do 2-week tours several times a year, and they're tough. People, wherever about one show, when you were doing, what was it, 8?
The longest tour I used to do was about 8 days.
8 days. Mine was 14. And
tough going.
Nationally, all over the country. And that's and I think Arctic Williams in the day, him and Peter Nolte did a 28-day tour.
Right.
And I think it was the only time they did it because it was so tough. But it is, when you're doing it independent, you're not like a big media company, like say Ring of Honor had, I can't think of the parent company who they had. You don't have that behind you, those resources, that full-time staff.
Yeah, well, it's probably like anything when you were, I think I said earlier, when you were doing the tours, particularly the 8-day one, it wasn't just that you were doing the 8 days, you had all the prep work, got to get all the media done, all the poster runs, because I used to good old posters around the town, around the area. Then you had to go back a week later, make sure they were all still up, and you sometimes find somebody taking them down, you had to start all over again. And just coordinating everybody, getting them transported, and it's tough. And it's not just that, it's just not those 8 days, which are tough, but you've all the tough work.
So your last shows in Northern Ireland were the Cricket Club shows in 2010.
2010, yes.
And my last shows in Northern Ireland were Glenarm or Larne, up that direction in Antrim. That was 2018. My last shows I promoted were 2019. Pandemic came in, like we said, and that knocked everything backwards. But we've created history. We had where we didn't need British promoters anymore or European American talent. We could do it with just Irish talent. And now today, in the environment that's going today with the likes of OTT, that continues in the digital age.
Yeah, it's like everything moves with the time. So yeah, we started something up that was quite special, unique, as we've talked about earlier on. Somebody else has moved on, but we never say never. We might end up back in the business again, doing shows in the new world, and I'll have to get a bit more savvy with my Instagram and Facebook, etc.
So, John, thank you very much for being the first guest here on Irish Whip Wrestling History. I don't know whether I'm going to do it with 4 or 5 people, but just to have that history there, and you've been a huge part of modern day independent wrestling in Northern Ireland. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time to interview me, and nice to reminisce about all those good times and memories we have.
So, folks, thanks for checking out this interview with John Noble, Northern Ireland's first modern day independent promoter. 1995 modern day.
You're giving away the age.
Thanks for watching and listening, folks.